Okay, that's fine.
There you go. We're live.
Yep.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be live with Doug Johnstone. Do you want to start off the group with an introduction to yourself and the books?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my name is Doug Johnstone, and I'm an author. It sounds like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting or something. Yeah, I've had 19 novels out in the world. It's almost, in fact, 19 novels in 19 years it's been. So I write mostly in the crime genre, but also more recently a trilogy of science fiction thrillers, I guess you would call them. I wrote a bunch of standalone books. You may tell from my accent I'm Scottish. Most of the books are set in Scotland. And more recently, after the standalone novels, the kind of thrillers, I've written a series about a family in Edinburgh called the Skelfs, who are three generations of women who run a funeral directors and a private investigators when the patriarch of the family dies. And that has been 6 books in that series now. And I'm working on the 7th one at the moment. So I guess most of my fiction is kind of around the edges of genre, or I don't really know what genre they are, or I don't really care. I don't write police procedurals, although I love to read them. I don't really know what I write. They're just quite odd. I guess you would call them quirky, although my publisher always tells me not to say that the books are quirky.
Why not?
I don't know. I think she thinks that maybe that impacts sales. But it's kind of, I don't set out to write quirky books, that's for sure. I think every time, most authors will be the same. Every time you have an idea for a book, you sort of think you have this flash of an idea or whatever, and then you're like, oh, this is going to be the most commercial blockbusting thing ever. Steven Spielberg is about to like be battering down my door to make a film of this. In my case, I then sort of tell my agent about it, and he sort of goes, what is it? So like, you know, that funeral director's idea or the science fiction ideas, for example. But it's worked out. I just enjoy writing what I write, and I let others worry about thinking about what genre it is, to be honest.
Well, I think a lot of people in the group have enjoyed the Skelfs books. That's how I came to your writing, reading those.
Okay.
I'm not done all 6 yet, but I have embarked on the journey. But I found the Enceladons ones very quickly after discovering the Skelfs, and have just inhaled those.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, it's just to sort of explain a little bit. So my most recent novel was The Transcendent Tide, which is the third part of the trilogy, the Enceladons trilogy, which you just mentioned there, which is the science fiction books. They're kind of, I think I would sell them as thrillers as well, because I know that it's a weird thing I didn't really appreciate beforehand, that a lot of people are put off by the term science fiction.
They've definitely got a lot of elements of thriller in as well, haven't they?
Well, yeah.
There's a lot of, like, you know, kind of secret bases and soldiers and things like that. There's if you were like thrillers, there's a lot to keep you entertained.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first 2 books are set in kind of contemporary Scotland, and they're about ordinary people who just happen to encounter this alien creature, which is kind of octopoid in nature, that comes from one of Saturn's moons, like you do. But my elevator pitch for that book, for the first one in the trilogy, which was The Space Between Us, I've got a whole bunch of books here. So it's really like E.T. meets Thelma and Louise set in the Scottish Highlands. That was my pitch for it in my own mind. It's not really that, but it is kind of, it's about ordinary people encountering this sort of this other kind of consciousness, this other kind of being, and they have to go on the run because there's nefarious forces that are chasing after them who want this thing, and so they have to scoot off across the Scottish Highlands. But I found that actually a lot of, just exactly the same as you, Kaz, that a lot of my Skelfs readers and crime readers, I think they were slightly maybe trepidatious to begin with about like delving into the first book, but I think they've absolutely loved it. Loved these sci-fi books. When the first book, I was really lucky that it was on Between the Covers on BBC Two with Sarah Cox. And I'm sure most people have seen that show, but it's, you know, a bunch of kind of celebrities sit around and talk about books. And Sarah said at the start of the show, she said, "Oh, I don't normally like science fiction, but I really like this." And then every single other person on the show said exactly the same thing. So, and they actually, I think one of them even said, "This is like science fiction for people who don't like science fiction." So that's my selling angle, I think, for people, is that I think it definitely is science fiction because there's all sorts of weird elements in it, but it's also very grounded in the everyday life. These people are like the characters in it are like me or you or anyone else watching, but they just happen to encounter these extraordinary things, which kind of makes it. I think if you ground the reader in all the sort of normal stuff, then they can. They're much more likely to come with you on the journey for all the sort of really weird stuff that you're making up in between.
You said, do you like sci-fi?
Okay, great.
So it worked for me. It put me in mind of things like Children of Time, but more accessible.
Yeah, Children. So that's the Adrian Tchaikovsky book. So that's. I mean, I think that's an amazing piece of work. But yeah, I guess there are elements that in keeping with some of Adrian's work. Like I've done events with Adrian Tchaikovsky, and we have a good chat afterwards, usually about like animal consciousnesses and alien consciousnesses and how societies and civilizations might grow up. He takes that much further than I do. Yeah. In a sort of incredible way, which is mind blowing, really. But I really admire that in his work. But I definitely, part of what I wanted to do, I was just really interested in how like ordinary people like us might cope in this sort of weird situation. So sci-fi, like movies especially, have always kind of bugged me, especially the big blockbuster movies where it's like aliens come here and they want to kill us or enslave us or whatever it is, and they always look kind of humanoid, and they can speak English somehow miraculously and all that kind of stuff. I was much more interested in things like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where there's this unknowable thing happening to ordinary people, and so I didn't want these aliens in these books to be knowable, if you know what I mean. They're not entirely understandable, because how could we understand something that grew up in a completely different environment for us? I mean, we can't even understand what dolphins are saying, and they live on the same planet as us. So how would we be able to? So I was just fascinated in writing about all of that stuff. But at the same time, I wanted it to be, a kick-ass thriller plot where people are chasing people and there's violence and guns and stuff like that. So I kind of just threw it all in the mix to see what happened, and luckily it paid off.
It would make a good like movie or TV show.
Well, I would love that. That'd be amazing. It is optioned for film at the moment. The Space Between Us, by a guy in Hollywood. So we will wait and see. I mean, like, I think you must have had this 100 times from other writers, but it's always a million miles away from actually anything getting made. I mean, lots of people are saying lovely things, and they option it and they re-option it, and there's a script for it which I've read is really good, but I'll wait until I see it on an actual cinema screen before I believe it's actually happened.
Is there equal interest in the Scouts? Because that's another series that do really well, I think, because it's unusual enough that it's a bit different to what people kind of expect to read in a crime book, but it's still, like you said, it's got those normal people and
yeah, no, it is. That's optioned as well. That's actually, the Skelf series has been optioned for television since before the first book came out. Actually, weirdly, they'd heard about it through a friend of a friend or something, and they picked up a copy of the first book. And it's inching ever closer to possibly being made, but who knows? But I think the setup for it. So just to sort of, I think I may. Here we go. Yeah, there's the first book in that Skelf series. It's called A Dark Matter. So those books are set in Edinburgh, which is a beautiful, picturesque city, which is where I live. And it's about those three generations of women. So there's three really strong roles for three female actors, and they're Dorothy, who's 70 years old, her daughter Jenny, who's 45, and her daughter Hannah, who's 20 at the start of the first book. And it's about how they negotiate basically running this funeral business after Dorothy's husband Jim dies at the start of the first book. And so they're dealing with their own grief, but also having to deal with the grief of other people as they negotiate the whole undertaker's side of things. But there's also this private investigator stuff, which is like a really useful way of having cases to solve and having, like, another hook for the reader. And so there's anything that I'm interested in writing about in a crime sort of scenario, I can use these three women as a great vehicle. So that's why there's been 6 books in like 5 years, I think. I mean, I've been knocking them out because I've really enjoyed spending time with the three of them. And I agree with you, Kaz. I think it would make a great TV show, but Whether or not that ever gets made, I mean, we'll wait and see. But I'm optimistic. I think that there's because it would be cinematic and also some really sort of meaty roles for actors to get stuck into, and some really interesting plots to go with it as well at the same time.
Did you have to do quite a bit of research into like undertaking and all of those processes to get it right?
Yeah, well, so I was a writer in residence at a funeral director's for 6 months. It was quite a long time ago, and so that came about through a wee. I mean, everyone always says, "How did that happen? What would that involve?" Good questions. So it was really quite odd. There was just an advert in the like local arts listings for. In fact, they weren't looking for a writer in residence. They were looking for any kind of artist in residence. So it could have been anything. So I just chucked a CV in and I got an interview and I had to put my suit on and go to the funeral directors and got interviewed by a bunch of funeral directors, like in a job interview. It was quite weird. And we kind of my pitch was that it wasn't actually using my skills as a novelist. It was more using my skills as a journalist because I'm also a freelance journalist. And I wanted to write about the role of the funeral director and what it is in society and how the people who do it, how doing that work affects their attitudes towards life and death in their own scenarios and their own lives. And I got the job. It was great. So for 2 days a week, for 6 months, I basically was in the funeral directors in Edinburgh. And there's quite a big company, and they had like offices all over, like Eastern Scotland and Northeast England as well. But so what I did was I basically interviewed as many staff as possible, like the funeral directors, but also like the more, the embalmers and morticians, the receptionists, the guys on the board, everything, and the drivers and everyone else. And I also job shadowed everyone, so I basically sat in on funerals being arranged, and I took part in funeral ceremonies. And I went with the guys in the body van to pick up the deceased from like the mortuary and from care homes and stuff like that. And so I did all of that stuff, and the end result was actually a small little non-fiction book, which wasn't actually published widely. They just kept it in-house with the company, and they give it to new employees now when they start, I think. But it was really a fascinating experience, and the idea wasn't to do it as research for a novel at all. In fact, there was a sort of running joke with the staff there, sort of saying, "Oh, you'll get loads of material for your books here, eh?" And I was like, "Well, I'm not sure I will, because I mean, good crime fiction thrives on conflict and tension, right? And the thing that funeral directors do is that they diffuse conflict and tension at a really stressful time for everyone involved, right?" One of them said to me, it's like being a wedding planner, except you have to do everything in a week and everyone's miserable. And I was like, wow, okay, yeah, I suppose it is. But the experience stuck with me. I really loved doing that work, and I was really impressed. I came away with a huge amount of respect for the people who do that work. It's not something I could do, I don't think. And the empathy they have for the people they work with and for the deceased as well. So it was kind of niggling away at me, like for a long time, for a couple of years, as like it might be a good backdrop for a book, but I couldn't see how to make it like a crime novel. And weirdly, at the same time, I'd also had this idea for years about a woman who had to take over a private investigator company when her dad dies, and then she doesn't know how to do it. And the thinking behind that was, it meant that I didn't have to research how to do it. So if she doesn't know, I don't know, and that's fine. And I can find out together. I can write about her trying to find out how to become a PI, basically. And then somewhere along the line, I just realized that these two ideas would actually work well together. So that's what happened. The whole thing kind of became expanded a little bit in my planning. So it kind of became a book about mothers and daughters, and grandmothers and granddaughters, and the relationship between women. And also Edinburgh is a big part of these books as well. It's a city I've known for a long time, and I'd kind of written about it a little bit, but I wanted to really dig deeply into what it's like as a city and what it's like to live here. So far so good. Book 7's coming out next year, and I don't see any end in sight at the moment, that's for sure. I'm really enjoying writing about them. So,
did you have any inspiration for the relationships between the women? Have you had anyone that you've sort of base study of those relationships on, because it must be quite difficult to write relationships between generations of.
Yeah, well, there's not any. Yeah, I understand what you mean. There's not any particular people, I don't think, that were inspirational, but like just everyone, like every mother and daughter, basically, people that I know. One of the things that kind of bugged me a little bit when I started writing the first book, there was a sort of trend at the time on social media, especially, of like generational sort of like generations bad mouthing each other, like boomers having a go at Gen Z or millennials having a go at Gen X and all that stuff. And I just thought it was so reductive and so pointless. I didn't see, I mean, people from the same generation don't necessarily all think the same way, right? You know, that's ridiculous. Like I'm roughly the same generation as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I don't think we've ever had the same opinion about anything, me and him, right? So, so it seems weird to say everyone in this generation thinks like this. And so I found I wanted to sort of do something a bit more interesting. And so, I mean, there are general traits to my three characters, but I don't think there's anything particularly that they represent in terms of their generations. Jenny's the middle one. She's the closest to me in age. She's like just a few years younger than me. So she is Generation X. She's quite self-destructive. And you know, there's elements of that in everyone. I think everyone feels a bit like that at times. She's kind of always kind of scuppering herself a little bit. Dorothy, who's older, and she is kind of part of the thinking behind Dorothy was, I mean, she's 70 years old at the start of the first book, which came out in 2020, and she's American, by the way. So she had come over to Scotland, you know, as a young woman, basically for love, and never left. So that meant that she was born in 1950 in California. So she was a teenager in the 60s in California. It's like there's nothing more cool and weird than that, right? That's really cool. And so I had been frustrated by sometimes the portrayal of older women in fiction as being, you know, one foot in the grave, essentially useless, like, you know, little old biddies sort of thing. And I found that really annoying and offensive. And so I wanted to create a woman who's 70, who is like a 70-year-old now. Like, you know, that's not, it doesn't feel old. You still feel youthful. You still have all sorts of youthful and interesting ideas. And so I wanted to try and dig into that deeply. And then Hannah, I was just really interested in looking at things from the point of view of a much younger woman. She's 20. I've got a teenage daughter, so she's not too far away from that. And, you know, I've got younger nieces and cousins as well who are around about that age. And I just think it's really fascinating how, I mean, these people are all digital natives, so they kind of grew up in a completely different world from the one I understand. But I think that's really fascinating. And I think the idea of dismissing younger generations or older generations out of hand is really stupid and annoying. And so I just kind of wanted to give everybody enough page time to really dig into them. And the books are deliberately like three-handers. There's not one lead character, I don't think. All three women have round about the same amount of page time, I think, roughly, in all the books. Some readers prefer one to the other and whatever, but I think but I deliberately wanted them all to be equal because they're all equally as important to me as a writer as well.
There's quite a lot of comments on the stream. Patsy says hello.
Oh, hey. Yeah.
She's a big fan. She said in Scotland, skelfs are splinters.
Yes. So yeah, that's so. I don't know if non-Scottish viewers will know that, but yeah, the word skelf is a Scots word, which means a splinter. You know, basically you get it under your skin. So as far as I know, skelf is not a surname. I've not come across anyone who's called that. I don't know where I had that idea for a long time. I just like the name skelf. Partly it's just like having, you know, they worm their way under your skin, that sort of thing. But also it feels like they kind of disrupt things a little bit. They kind of get under the skin of the reader, and they kind of get under the skin of the things they're trying to investigate as well. So it kind of works on a couple of levels, but I don't shout about that too often. Yeah, but skelfs are splinters. Yeah.
She's also very chuffed that you're saying that, you know, people who are 70 can still do stuff because she's 70 next year.
Well, I get that a lot at book events, like older readers that will come to me and sort of, you know, really identify with Dorothy. I had an incredible thing in I think it was the Edinburgh Book Festival last year, where there was 3 women there who were around about the age of the 3 Skells women, and they were grandmother, like mother and daughter. And I think the mother had, so the woman about my age had given the first Skells book to her mum, who was 70, when her husband died, which is what happens in the first book. And I was like, holy shit! But she'd loved it, and she'd kind of she'd found the books helpful in a way in dealing with grief, because one of the things that I really wanted to write about after that experience of working at the funeral directors was to talk really openly about the whole process of death and funerals and grief and mourning, because I think it's something that, especially in Western societies, that we tend to brush under the carpet a little bit. We don't want to think about, and I feel like we've become very distanced from the idea of the dead and of mourning or grieving for the deceased, or having ceremonies that celebrate them in a meaningful way. I think we've maybe all been to funerals where it just feels like it's kind of the next one on the treadmill or whatever, and you're in and out, and it's like someone gets up and says something who didn't know the person particularly well. And I think that kind of does a disservice to everyone. And I think that one of the things in these books that I wanted to write about was how important death is in life, and how important grief is. But they're not, I don't think they're sad books. I mean, you could maybe say about this as well as a reader, Kaz, but they're kind of blackly funny, and they're kind of open, and they're quite positive books, I think, and they're becoming kind of more positive as this series has gone on. I'm writing about different ways of thinking about the funeral industry, for example, and the whole business of death, if you like, and how we go about funerals, and thinking about the environment, and how we be more progressive about all this sort of stuff. So I kind of, so hopefully, touch wood, that readers who have experienced that stuff in their own lives find something that's positive in these books to think about and relate to their own experience.
Yeah, I think they've got a positive spin, haven't they? They're not all, for as much as they're set in a funeral directors, or they've got bits of things like that, and they're not all like depressing, are they? Like you said, they've got a lot of black humor and things. You've got a comment, is Dorothy a female you?
No, I wish.
She's drummer. Is it something to do with being a drummer?
Well, there are elements. I think it's like, I don't think you have to be, Sigmund Freud or a psychologist to work out that there's elements of me in all 3 of these women. So yeah, Dorothy is a drummer, and I play drums. I've played drums all my life, and I realized, I'd written books in the past that had music in them, and there was, like, especially the Ossians, my second novel, was about a band, and the Deadbeat, another one, had a sort of quite a lot of music in it and stuff. But I'd never written specifically about drumming and what it is like to be a drummer, and why it's different from playing other instruments, and the good and bad things about it. And so I just thought this would be a perfect opportunity to write about drumming and what it means to me. So there are obvious elements of that in there. And I thought it was really interesting to make the older of the 3 characters, the 70-year-old, the drummer, because why not? If she grew up in 60s California, she might well be a drummer. And so I think that tied into my idea of making Dorothy more 3-dimensional. But there are elements that are not me about Dorothy. She's kind of she's not religious, I don't think, but she's spiritual. She's influenced by Buddhism. She does yoga. I do yoga every day now, actually, but that's beside the point. But she is kind of very open-minded and open-hearted. It's kind of more like aspirational than me. It's like, I kind of think, I'd like to be a bit more like that, and that she's always thinking about what it's like from the other person's point of view. She has a lot of empathy, I think, naturally, which I think a lot of us maybe would like to have, but maybe struggle to every day. But she's kind of up there. But it's not all sweetness and light. There's other stuff going on with her as well. So there's definitely elements of me in there, but I wish I was as calm and patient as Dorothy, put it that way.
Donna has said that mothers and daughters don't always understand their own relationships with each other generally.
Well, I think that's really fascinating. I agree with that completely, 100%. Also, I think it's not just that I think I'm really interested in quite often characters who don't know their own motivations. I know that it might seem weird as a fiction writer, but that's what it's like in real life. Sometimes we don't understand why we do the things we do. Sometimes we don't understand why we don't get on with our mums or our dads or our sons and daughters or whatever. Okay, sometimes it's hard to self-analyze about this stuff, and I think that I've always wanted to try and reflect that in the fiction that I write, so that characters aren't always 100% sure about what they think about everything all the time, because that's not realistic. That's not how people are in the real world, right? So it's so that, especially with the mothers and daughters relationship, and I've made these three women in the Skelfs, quite different in terms of their own personalities, and so they inevitably sort of rub each other up the wrong way at times, which is a constant source of great stuff if you're writing fiction, because that's the interesting things. When people, if everybody got on all the time, it'd be the most boring book of all time, right?
Well, I don't know, actually. You could probably have a good story about friends doing like a good adventure together.
You can, yeah, you can. I mean, I think it's a matter of.
My Little Pony proved that you can do that, because that's all about being like friends.
Yeah, all friends together, solving a very mild-mannered crime. Yeah, I think that and in the end, the Skelfs women are supportive of each other. They are underneath it all, despite all the sort of surface tensions. They're always there for each other, and it's actually the same with the Enceladin's trilogy with the science fiction books, because that there are three central human characters in those books as well, and they're very different from each other. They're not related at all. In fact, at the start of the first book, they're all kind of alone in their own little worlds, and they don't have any kind of like community or sense of connection about them. And there's like Lennox, who's a teenager in the care system, and Ava, who's kind of she's kind of in a coercive relationship with her husband. And there's Heather, who is suffering grief because her daughter has died and she's divorced. And so they're all kind of alone in their own ways, but through what happens in the book, through their connection with this alien creature, they find a sense of community with each other. It's like a found family story. And so they are also coming from very different directions and very different backgrounds, but they end up finding each other and being the support network that they needed all along, I think.
Yeah, no, you're right. And they're sort of, even in the midst of everything not always being the best, kind of that relationship between them brings a bit of positivity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What they find in each other kind of helps all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives them all like a second chance at a family, effectively. I think that none of them really have a support network or a family like the Skelfs women in the Skelfs books, but through what happens in the books, and it changes, the relationship changes quite drastically, especially in the third one, physically as well as emotionally. But I think it's that chance, that second chance of being a mum or having a family or having other people there to support you, however it comes, I think is one of the sort of driving forces of what those books were about as well.
Is that it's interesting that that's a theme across like two of your series. Is it something you explored in the standalones as well?
Yeah, I did. I was a little bit. It's kind of harder in a sense to do it in a standalone book because you don't have as much time. Like literally, you don't have as much page time to sort of build those really strong relationships. I mean, if you can do it over 3 books in a trilogy or 6 books and counting in the series, it's much more fulfilling, I think, for the reader, because it's built upon stuff that's happened in previous books. I was doing it a little, yeah, certainly with some of the standalones. I was certainly looking at that stuff as well. I think the one that stands out is probably the last standalone novel I wrote before this. I started the Skelfs, which was a book called Breakers, which was about a young man, a 17-year-old boy, really, who is coerced into becoming a burglar by his step siblings, and so it's a fairly uncompromising book about like some quite bad behavior, But in the end, I think you do have empathy and sympathy for the central character. But that was about him not having that support network. He finds it in other ways throughout the book. But he was, between in a rock and a hard place because he's being forced to commit these crimes. The police are trying to find him. Some other gangs are trying to find him, and he also might get killed by his own stepbrother. It's like, so the stress is piling on top of him. But in amongst all that, he still manages to find a kind of family and support that he needs. But yeah, I mean, I think it's endlessly families are endlessly fascinating, I think, to write about, because every family is different, and their relationships are always different, and you can kind of get trapped in certain behaviors. If you know somebody from when they're little to when they grow up, an adult person, it can be quite hard to get a different idea of who that person is and all that stuff. So there's loads to write about. There's lots of interesting angles to take it from.
I'm not trying to keep up. There's so many comments coming in. Donna's not being very kind about families.
Well, they're tricky. Families are tricky.
They can be. I mean, some people have good ones. I'm blessed with lovely parents. I started a book group from my dad, so
Well, I'm blessed with lovely parents as well. I'm thankfully still with us. And my dad used to be an English teacher a long, long time ago, and he still does. He goes to a book group every week, and that's one of the main ways that we connect. Actually, is talking about books. So we're always recommending stuff to each other. Whatever he's doing in his book group, I'll quite often pick it up afterwards and have a read, and then we can talk about it. So so sometimes families are easy as well. Sometimes they're a really good sense of support as well.
Yeah, my dad's an engineer. We normally connect on weird nerdy stuff.
Yeah, fair enough.
Patsy says she likes how you produced the three women. So Dorothy was married until death has depart. A daughter was married until divorce and then death. And the granddaughter had a same-sex marriage.
Yeah, again, a lot of that is, I think, I don't know how much of that was planned. I mean, I certainly had an idea when I started that I wanted the Skells to be more than one book. I knew, because I'd written a bunch of standalones and I was kind of wanting to start writing a series. My initial idea was it to be a trilogy, and so I just was having far too much fun writing about them. I didn't want to stop, basically. But yeah, I don't know how much of that was consciously planned. There are sort of, I can't really, the sort of planning stages start off very nebulous. You kind of just, I tend to just write bunches of like stream of consciousness stuff to begin with, things that I want to write about, things that are interesting, things that might work, like that comment, like in sort of opposition to each other or juxtaposition with each other. And so I just thought, well, if one of them has this relationship, maybe one of them, so yeah, Dorothy has had basically a 50-year, happy marriage. But that's not the case for Jenny, who's had a very different kind of relationship with her husband, then ex-husband. And Hannah, well, I mean, she's kind of relatively young and uncynical and finds love, quite simply with a woman. And so I just wanted to write about that, but it's certainly not part of. I'm not trying to make any comment about her sexuality because it's just part of the background. It's just the way she is. It's the way she lives. And like anyone else, it should just be accepted. So I just found it, I'm not sure how much of that stuff I consciously think about when I was planning the first book, and how much of it just kind of fell out of what the things I want to write about more than anything else, maybe.
How do you find like keeping track of them as they go across the books? Because it's very much centered on their lives. So you must have to like keep a careful track of like what you've decided about all three of the women.
Yeah.
Because I'd imagine by book 7, you're going to have some eagle-eyed readers that if you suddenly change something, they're going to know.
Yes. Yeah, I do have to keep track. I didn't do that at the start. And that was a real pain in the arse, to be honest. I had to go back and sort of like write. It's not, and if you write for a TV show, you get this thing called a Bible, which is like a list of everyone's relationships and, whoever's done whatever in the whole history of the TV show. I don't have like a Bible, but I do now have a list of Like, I have lists of stuff that have like the main things that have happened in the books each time, what the main cases are, the plot lines, what the main personal developments are for each of the three central characters. Because Dorothy starts off basically a widow, and then gradually, as the books go on, she kind of has a friendship with Thomas, who's a police detective, and then that becomes more than a friendship, and so on. And Jenny's kind of in and out of different relationships, and Hannah's and her girlfriend, then wife, Indy, they're tested in various ways as well. So I do keep a note of all that stuff as well. I also have a list of all the funerals, all the dead people. So anyone who's ever mentioned, who ever gets buried or cremated or now resumated or various other things, or whose body is picked up from the morgue or anything else. I've got a list of who all of those people are, anything I know about them, how they were, what kind of funeral they had, where it was, and all this kind of stuff. So I do have lists of stuff now. I try not to look back at it too much. I try to write a first draft without looking at it. But I mean, when I'm sort of reworking it, I will have to go back and go, wait, what did that person do 4 books ago, or whatever, if it comes up. And I quite like, one of the things I've really enjoyed doing with the Skelfs is, one of the reasons why it became more than a trilogy is that I don't like tying stuff up in a neat bow necessarily, and so there's always some aftermath stuff. So after the first couple of books, there was definitely aftermath stuff, and then I kind of had I did end that sort of third book with a kind of resolution, but then I thought, well, what about the other side of this? Nobody is necessarily all like one thing. Nobody's all good or all bad. Nobody thinks of themselves as a villain, right? So if you've portrayed someone in a couple of two or three books as being the bad guy, inverted commas, then that person is also someone's brother, someone's father, someone's son. Okay. So what is it like from those people's point of view to have this other person in their life, like acting the way they do or whatever? And so there's always more, and I keep bringing minor characters back, occasionally for like little cameos and things. And so I do have to try and keep a track of all that as well, like, and how they've. So if I haven't seen someone for 3 years and 3 books, then what have they been doing in that time? And all that kind of stuff. So I've made it really quite hard for myself, I suppose, but it's something I really enjoy, because it feels like when you get to books 5, 6, and hopefully now 7 coming and more, that it feels like a richer experience for the reader. Like they're really embedded in this world, because these are real characters, real people coming in and going out of the sort of network of each other's lives in a way that is kind of really like what we are like in real life.
Donna wants to know if you're tempted to join some of your fellow crime writers and set a standalone in the US, as it seems to be working out okay for them. I feel like your books are very rooted in Scotland. Even when they've travelled out, there's always a link back.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, she's absolutely right that it has worked really well for a lot of authors. I certainly am not against it. I did have an idea for a while about writing a sequel to one of the standalones set in California, but I'm not sure. I didn't do it at the time, and I'm not sure if I'm really motivated to do it anymore. I don't think I would write. I don't think I would ever write about. I mean, never say never, right? But I don't think I would be comfortable writing about from the point of view of an American character in America, for example. I think if I was to write it like if that was the only point of view, I would be more inclined to write about a Scottish person in America, like a fish out of water, or the whole experience of encountering American society in various ways as an outsider, which is one way that it could be tackled. And most of the books that I've written have been set in Scotland, but in fact, the most recent one, The Transcendent Tide, is almost all set in Greenland, which is not somewhere I've ever been.
I was going to ask you if you've been to Greenland.
Well, I haven't, partly because it's so expensive to get there. So the book is set in East Greenland, which is actually an even more remote part of Greenland than the West, which is where the capital is. Which is already pretty remote. And it's cost something like £2,000 to get there from Reykjavik. So you have to get to Iceland first to fly into Kulusuk. So I did a ton of research about Greenland, like loads. I mean, as much as you can about Greenland, because it's not very populated. There's not a huge amount about it online. But I did the best that I could, as much as I could, researching about it. And that's the first time I'd written extensively about somewhere where I'd never been. And I didn't worry about that. In the end, I did manage to track down someone who could read it for authenticity, an actual Greenlandic Inuit guy who lived in Tasiilaq, which is the main town where the action is all set. And that was really fascinating. And I was relieved to get the sort of feedback from him saying it's just more or less it's spot on with a few different, a few small alterations and stuff. So that was I really appreciate that feedback. But I think now I've written about Greenland, I think, well, why not? I could write about somewhere else. I could put myself in those shoes. And I have plenty of ideas for books, one of which is very global, actually, which is set in lots of different places around the world. But again, they're all places where I've been. So maybe I'm hamstringing myself a little bit. But I wouldn't rule anything out, I think. But the one thing that I would say is that I think I would struggle to write something that isn't grounded in ordinary people. Like I couldn't really write about a spy running about, a James Bond character or whatever, just because it wouldn't feel authentic to me, because I think I wouldn't really care enough. And I think that readers would probably, they would sense that in the pages, sense that in the story, that this didn't feel as authentic as something that I could have written if it was set in more grounded reality.
So apparently Steve would love a book set in California, Steve Munoz.
Great.
So Patsy's suggesting that you could send Dorothy back to California.
Well, that has certainly crossed my mind. One of the things that I think after this 7th novel, I think I'm going to have a collection of short stories published. I think it's exclusive. I don't think I've talked about this anywhere. And there will be some Skelf's short stories in there as well. And these aren't written yet, so that was definitely one of the ideas I had, was for Dorothy to go back to California. She's from a place called Pismo Beach. She grew up in, again, which is somewhere where I've been, which is not like the glamorous Los Angeles, Santa Monica, whatever. It's sort of slightly more working class. I mean, it's got a beach. It's called Pismo Beach, obviously, but it's a more ordinary kind of working class town, and so that might be an option. Yes, but I worry about. Because that's not. I think I would struggle to make Dorothy go back to California in the middle of a novel. I mean, I could do it, but I just feel it would kind of feel like a little bit like jumping the shark a little bit. But a kind of lengthy short story might be the way to go with that, I think. But yeah, it's a great idea. Don't worry, I've been chewing that one over, definitely.
Good. They'll be pleased to hear that. I'm intrigued as to someone because you studied physics.
Yeah.
What made you then go into crime writing from physics?
Oof, how long have we got? Well, I was so I was always interested in writing. I was writing stories at school, actually, just for my own amusement, for English class. I really enjoyed doing that. But I was also very good at physics and maths. I also loved playing football, and I was totally interested in astronomy and space and all that sort of stuff. So I don't think I've always kind of shied away from that idea of being science and the arts being opposite ends of a spectrum. It's all just much of a muchness, right? It's all really interesting. I geek out about all sorts of stuff. That's absolutely fine. And so I really like physics. So I ended up going to university studying physics, but I was still writing stories, kind of sending them into competitions and anthologies and stuff. And I started to do a bit of journalism because I'm also a musician. I play drums and guitar and stuff. And I was in bands, and I started to do a bit of music journalism. And by that time I had graduated and I was working as an engineer, and I hated that job. I just could not give a shit about it. I just didn't care about what I was doing. I was a systems engineer, and I just couldn't be bothered. It wasn't for me. And at the same time, I was starting to get stuff published in newspapers and magazines, like journalism. And so I quit my engineering job and became a music journalist, which was a bit of a shock to my mum, especially. But I loved what I was doing. I was writing for a living, and I was really into it, and I was hustling for work, and I was going to see bands and gigs and interviewing, and it sort of spread to more generally arts journalism. So I was interviewing authors sometimes, and I started to take my own fiction writing a bit more seriously at that stage. And instead of just writing the odd short story here and there, I sort of sat down and decided to write a novel, which was about a band. So it was about a terrible indie band who fall apart in a mess of drinking drugs on a tour of the Highlands. They say write about what you know, right? So I had been in crappy indie bands for years, and I thought it was a really interesting scene, and I wanted to write about it. And so that's how the fiction came about. I don't think, again, coming back to what I was saying right at the start, I don't really think about genre at all. That first novel that I wrote was not the first one that I got published. It actually was I had to rewrite it, and it became the second one. And I don't know if it was a crime novel or not. It was, I mean, there was guns in it, and violence and drugs, and all sorts of bad behavior. So I guess it was a crime novel, but I didn't think of it like that. But my first novel that got published was a book called Tombstoning, which I didn't think of as a crime novel either, but I mean, it had a dead body in it, and a suspicious death on Arbroath Cliffs, so of course it was a crime novel. And so I kind of fell into crime writing a little bit. I mean, it wasn't until my third novel, I think, that I was really obviously definitely trying to write a kind of thriller. That was a book called Smokeheads, and even then, it's not. I mean, it is a crime novel, but it's about a bunch of folk who go to a Scottish island and try and on a whiskey drinking weekend, and it all goes tits up. It's basically Deliverance meets Whiskey Galore. That's the pitch for that one. And so I kind of fell into that. So I was just writing, really. I was writing non-fiction first, and then fiction, and then it's gradually become more focused on crime, and now science fiction and other stuff as well. But it's been a bit of a long journey, I guess.
Is the sort of trip into the science fiction a little nod to that science interest?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I sort of didn't write about science at all in a lot of the first novels. I wasn't using that stuff at all. I did start writing about it in the Skells books because Hannah, the youngest of the three characters, is studying astrophysics at the start of the first book. She's gone on to do a PhD, which means I get to write about a lot of science and astrophysics and physics stuff, quantum mechanics and all sorts of weird stuff, but hopefully not in a impenetrable way. It's kind of using it all as a kind of backdrop and a little bit of a metaphor. I mean, a lot of the titles of those early Skells books are all about science things. They're kind of, double play on words, like a dark matter is a dark matter thing in physics, but also it's about funerals and death, so it's also dark. And so I got to write about the physics stuff in the Skells books. But then I was also really interested in other aspects of science stuff, just geeky stuff. And the science fiction was definitely an outlet for that. I was super interested in things like animal consciousnesses and communication and linguistics and all that sort of stuff, which kind of fed into the Enceladus trilogy, definitely. And how evolution and biology and how animals might evolve in different circumstances. And I did a load of, I mean, it's weird to call it research because it's just fun because you're just reading books about stuff you're interested in, right? So I just was reading about a lot of that stuff. And then it kind of all spilled out into those books. And I think most of the ideas the ideas I have for stories now are kind of half and half, I guess you would say, crime-ish and more speculative science fiction. Quite a lot of them are quite crossovery as well, and sometimes they will obviously be something that you would maybe put in a Skells book, but other times they might be something that might be a new sci-fi series or a new standalone sci-fi or speculative novel. I'm not really sure. But I'm definitely super. I mean, I subscribe to New Scientist and I love all that stuff. And so I find that really interesting. And loads of books are dealing with that stuff now, like crime fiction, literary fiction, everything else. Like, you can hardly move for a book about AI now. In literary fiction, there's lots of speculative stuff as well. So I just think it's really interesting. Science fiction is a really good vehicle for writing about our lives today, but not making it as direct as that. So the Space Between Us, the first Enceladus book, is really a book about how we treat refugees, partly as well, how we treat others, if we dehumanize people, how we can basically treat them badly, how we treat people who come into our country or our world, potentially uninvited. And so, but it allows you to write about that stuff in a way that is more palatable. Yeah, it's still dealing with the same issues, I think.
Yeah, no, really good point. I like the bits of physics stuff and thing. I live with a physicist, so
Okay.
you know, I spend a lot of time getting exposed to that kind of things.
Getting exposed. That's exactly the right phrase. Getting exposed to physics. Yeah, that's fair enough. I find all that stuff really, I mean, mind blowing. Like the big picture stuff of physics, especially about the nature of existence. It's like it actually gets to a point where it's quite like philosophy or spirituality or religion actually as well. And I find it. I don't necessarily know what I think about all of that, but I'm interested and enjoying exploring it anyway, because I just find the whole thing fascinating.
Yeah, I say that to the kids that I teach science to. It's so much like I study genetics, and that has the same thing, doesn't it? Because it's like what makes you you.
Yeah.
So you've got that same, like, it can delve into being philosophy and ethics and all sorts of things, and it's miraculous, all the things that you explore.
Yeah, the big questions, definitely.
Yeah. I always try and say that to get them inspired into science. Patsy thinks you should get the first book republished, Tombstoning.
Sorry, say that again.
Patsy says you should get the first book republished.
Well, yeah, it is. So that is happening. So my first two novels, Tombstoning and The Ossians, have been out of print for quite a long time. Actually, they were originally published by Penguin way back in the day, but next year, 2026, is going to be the 20th anniversary of Tombstoning coming out. So I'll also this Seven Skelfs book that I've written is going to be my 20th novel in 20 years. So it felt like a time to maybe have a little bit of a celebration. And try and get those books back out. So my current publisher, Arenda Books, they're putting together a brand new shiny edition of Tombstoning and The Ossians, actually, and they're both coming out early next year. So Tombstoning is coming out in February, so not long, and it's got a lovely introduction by Chris Brookmeyer at the start of it, because he was one of the very first people to say something nice about that book, or any of my writing, in fact. And The Ossians is going to come out in April next year as well, with a brand new cover. And it's got an introduction by Val McDermott, because she, again, was one of the very first people to say something nice about that book too. So it'll be fun. I'm looking forward to doing some events about all that stuff. And then the Skelfs book comes out in August. So I'm going to be busy next year. One of the things, if anyone who knows me knows that I'm not nostalgic about the past. I don't give a shit about what I've done in the past. I'm always kind of looking at the next thing. But I guess this is a little time for a breather to sort of look back 20 years and sort of see what the hell I was writing about 20 years ago, and how things have changed. So it'll be interesting. I'm not sure it'll be entirely comfortable, me looking back 20 years at what I wrote, because I feel like a very different person now, and probably a very different writer as well. But it'll be interesting anyway, and it gives readers a chance to sort of, I mean, a lot of readers won't have come across these first two books, and there was a lot of, I mean, I think you can see a lot of the same kinds of themes and sort of and settings and kinds of characters, ordinary characters thrown into extraordinary circumstances. They certainly still have that same element about them. So 2026 is going to be pretty fun. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. You need to come back and talk to us about books then. Patsy says, before I ask you my favourite question, Patsy says she wants to say thank you for your friendship with her sister Fiona.
Oh, I mean, absolutely more than welcome. Yes, that was, I mean, it's one of the incredible things about being a writer is meeting readers. I mean, it's such an obvious thing, but it's like, but you really get to know readers in a way, and that's happened, I feel like, so much more since I've been writing the Skelfs series, that I think readers have really connected with those books in a way that they perhaps didn't with the standalone novels, again because they've had more time with these characters. But it's been, I mean, it's endlessly kind of rewarding to talk to readers in signing queues or at festivals, at the bar, whatever, and realize that something that you've written means something to someone. It's incredible. I can't really express my thanks enough about all that sort of stuff.
Well, I mean, I've spoken to Patsy about that, and it was very kind of you. So thank you. I like to ask people what they've read recently and really enjoyed. And as it's November and we're coming up to the end of the year, you could even tell us what your favourite reads this year have been so
Oh.
far.
Okay, I've probably got a bunch. Let me think off the top of my head. What have I read? So since this is a UK crime book club, a couple of crime things that I've
We
read.
can go across to genres. We don't mind.
That's fine. That's fine. I mean, I don't. I read so widely. I still do some arts journalism. Like I write a book review column for the Big Issue, and I read across all genres there. There's a writer called Sarah Gran, an American writer, who I think is really underrated in this country. She had a book of short stories came out earlier this year. I think it's just called 10 Little Mysteries or 10 Mysteries. There's kind of interconnected short stories that are kind of like detective things, but very weird. Right up my street, like just really strange, kind of existential, very odd, but also with the kind of driving detective cases to be solved thing going on as well. I've done a few events this year with Adamo Ubangi, whose novel Esperance starts off as a kind of crime thriller, ends up very much in science fiction territory, and that's why I've been doing events with them, because we are kind of both crossover writers. I love that Esperance. That's called. That's really good.
That is one of my favourite books this year as well.
Yes, definitely. It's so good. Yeah, it starts off as one thing but ends up like wildly different. It's great. I love it. I read it. One of the most incredible books I've read is a memoir by Richard Flanagan. I don't know if it came out in paperback this year. It was like towards the start of the year. I read called Question 7, which is he's the author. He won the Booker Prize for The Narrow Road to the Deep North, I think it's called. Yeah, I think there was a BBC adaptation recently. And his memoir is extraordinary. It's quite incredible about, I can't even, it's hard to even know how to describe it. It's not a standard memoir at all. It's about, he grew up in Hobart in Tasmania. So there is elements of his life in it, but it's also about his dad was a prisoner of war, an Australian prisoner of war in Japan. And basically, the sort of central idea is like Richard Flanagan wouldn't even be alive if they hadn't dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, because his dad would have died in prison camp and whatever. And so it's like about morality, I guess, and about how we live. And it sounds kind of really heavy and deep, but it's not at all. It's written in little snapshots and vignettes. It's quite a strange style, but it sort of flips around on itself in time-wise and chronology. I'm not really explaining it properly, but it's an incredible book. I read it twice now, actually. I very rarely go back and reread stuff, certainly not as quickly as that. But I had to go back and have another look at it to sort of try and work out what the hell I just read. I absolutely loved that. Yeah, I loved that. And I'll recommend a graphic novel as well if people are interested in that stuff. There's American guy called Anders Nielsen, who wrote a big, heavy graphic novel called Tongues Volume 1. It's incredible. It looks amazing, and it's basically a retelling of Prometheus, the Prometheus myth, but it's about 300 pages of incredible drawings and a kind of really weird. It's set in a kind of sci-fi landscape or something. I don't even know how to. You can tell I'm just reading weird stuff now, aren't I? But but I loved it. It was so incredible, and the artwork is amazing. It's not cheap because it's a big chunky hardback thing. But I got book tokens from someone and splurged that on it. But it was definitely worth it. So that was called, I think it's called Tongues Volume 1. I can only hope there's a Tongues Volume 2 because it was so good.
I love a good graphic novel. Are you tempted to go into writing something like a graphic novel? There's a lot of good Scottish crime writers, right, for graphic novel series.
I would love that. Yeah, you're right. Like Val's done one, Denise Miner's done one. There's a whole. I think Ian did one as well, didn't he? Ian Rankin. So I would love to do something like that. I've got absolutely zero artistic skill whatsoever. I cannot draw. I can do stick men and that's it. So I would need to get together with an artist. I don't know how that comes about. That usually would be suggested by publishers, I suspect, or agents. If anyone listening to this wants to throw a graphic novelist at me, I would love to do something like that, because I think I write very visually anyway. Like I think I picture scenes in my mind before I write them. So I think I would be able to tell a story, I write quite economically as well. I kind of short and don't hang about. So I think I have the kind of writing style for a graphic novel, but I would need someone to actually do the graphic bit of it, because that is not my cup of tea at all.
Yeah, well, that's normally how it works, isn't it? And then we're at the end of our time. So remind people what they're going to go away and buy if they haven't already bought all of them. Like
Wow.
Patsy's watching, she said she's got all 19.
Wow.
So
Amazing.
you're not selling any for her, but everyone else.
Yes. So the most recent book is The Transcendent Tide. That's the third part of a trilogy. If you wanted to start at the beginning of the sci-fi trilogy,
Which you need to.
the first book is The Space Between Us. And the other thing we talked about mostly was the Skelfs. There's 6 books in the series. The first one is A Dark Matter, which gets you introduced to the Skelfs. But if you're almost up to date, then the most recent one was called Living as a Problem, which came out last year. But you know, there's 19 books to choose from. I'm going to help myself, and there's 2 getting reissued early next year. So
plenty to go on.
Yeah.
And then all that's left to say is thanks. It's been a pleasure.
I've really enjoyed it, Kaz. Thank you so much.